Hello dear viewer of my channel. Emily is with you. For the most interesting stories, watch the video until the end. Subscribe and like the video, I will be very pleased. I love you all.
Story time about how my boyfriend sent me proof that he was cheating on me by mistake. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's sent to me on Instagram. My stupid, idiotic boyfriend is so dumb. Like, seriously dumb. We've been dating for 6 months and we met on a dating app. As soon as we became boyfriend and girlfriend, he introduced me to all of his friends. And one of his best friends happens to be a girl. A very, very good looking girl. And no, I didn't even let it bother me because he told me he loved me and he liked me. And obviously, like, why wouldn't he just date her? But here's the thing. Every time I would hang out with her and my boyfriend, she would make it so obvious that she was competing for his attention. She would wear really short crop tops and show off all her cleavage. And if a big group of us went to a bar, she would make sure to get super drunk and make a scene. And anytime that she would get hit on by a guy, she would run to my boyfriend and tell her to save him. And he did everything she told him to. A few weeks ago, we were all at a house party and she made sure to only dance with him the entire night. Of course, this made me uncomfortable, so I started asking him questions. He denied everything profusely, so I just let it go. But a few days later, I get a screenshot that he obviously meant to send to one of his guy best friends about his girl best friend. And this screenshot was a picture that she had sent him, along with a few messages that they had sent each other. He told her that she looked hot in the picture and that she was hoping I would break up with him soon. What more proof did I need? Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how my stupid boyfriend sent me proof that he was cheating on me by mistake. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's sent to me on Instagram. In the screenshot that he sent me by mistake, I read the messages between him and his girl best friend. And the last message was her asking him, so when are you gonna break up with her to be with me? Mind you, my boyfriend and I have been together for 6 months. We had already talked about getting an apartment together and I didn't see this coming whatsoever. So here's what I did. I took a screenshot of the screenshot he sent me and I sent it back to him. When I saw that he read it, he didn't say anything. So instead I tried to call him. Guess what? He blocked me. I was at work at the time, so I couldn't leave my job. But I spent the rest of my shift running to the toilet because I had diarrhea. I was nervous and my palms were super sweaty. Mom spaghetti. But seriously, I felt sick to my stomach. After an hour, I realized that he was totally gonna ignore me. I decided to send the screenshot to her. That's when this girl told me to leave them alone and that my boyfriend didn't want to hear from me ever again. I told her that he was the one that needed to tell me that. Then she sends me a picture of him and her kissing. She was ruthless. Once my shift ended, I drove straight to his house, but he wasn't there. I went to the bar where they usually hang out, but they weren't there either. Finally, a few hours later, I get a message from him telling me that I just need to get over him and that the relationship wasn't going anywhere. Oh yeah, and that he was totally in love with his best friend, but he didn't realize it until he started dating me. He even left all of my stuff in a box outside of his house. It's been a week and I still haven't seen his face. I want to get back with him, but I realize he's a bad guy. What do I do? Story time about how I lied to my parents about having a boyfriend for 4 years. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My parents are super strict. Growing up, I could not have any guy friends. I wasn't even allowed to go over to my girlfriends' houses. At school, I was pretty popular, and the fact that my parents didn't let me have any boyfriends made the boys actually want me more, which is something my dad actually hated. Boys would call our house asking to talk to me, and my dad would grill me about it. So I finally decided to tell him that because he doesn't let me date any boys, that boys want me more. He laughed and said that that wasn't true, and that most likely I was just provoking these boys. Obviously, this really upset me. My dad was always really controlling. When I turned 16, I decided I wanted to get my own job. This way I could have some more freedom and just meet more people outside of school. I started working at a local restaurant and quickly made friends with everyone who was working there. They were all pretty much my age, especially one boy. Let's call him Rick. Rick and I hit it off right away. I had a huge crush on him instantly and I could tell that he liked me too. But of course, my strict parents were always present in my mind, so I tried my best to stay away from Rick just so that I wouldn't develop any feelings, which I already had, who am I kidding? One day, Rick asked me if I wanted to take my break with him and I said yes. He sat in his car for 30 minutes and just talked the entire time. I started falling in love with him. We talked so much and he was so kind and so funny. The next few days at work, we were basically inseparable. Finally, at the end of the week, he asked me if I wanted to be his girlfriend and I said yes. Without a moment of hesitation, I said yes, knowing that my parents would not want that at all. So here's when I told him that we needed to keep this a secret. He wanted to just speak to my parents, but I begged him not to. Thankfully, he understood. The only time we were able to spend together was at work. And we did this for a full year. When I turned 17, my parents insisted that I quit my job so that I could focus on school. I pretty much had to listen to them, so I did. This meant that Rick and I barely ever saw each other. Instead, I decided to sneak him into my house every single night. Part 2 is up. So I started sneaking my boyfriend into my room every single night. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My parents had literally no idea. I snuck my boyfriend Rick into my room every single night for a full year. The only time we ever got close to getting caught, the smoke alarm in our house went off, and as soon as we heard it, Rick jumped out through my window. My room was on the first floor, so this wasn't really an issue at all. I finally graduated from high school and started going to college. It became way easier to hide my relationship from my parents because I was living in a dorm. Rick would come visit me every single weekend, and my parents would come to visit me every now and then. Even when I was in college, you guys, my parents were still super strict. So one day I decided to ask my dad when I could have a boyfriend. He said when I was living under my own roof and paying my own bills. So the following year, that's exactly what I did. I was able to get a good job in my field, and so did Rick. So we put our money together and his parents helped us to get an apartment. But here's the thing, I didn't want my parents to know that I had a boyfriend this whole time. So instead I told them that Rick was my roommate who I met in college, and that I finally just decided that I wanted my own freedom. My dad was really proud of me for taking the initiative, which was crazy to me. He said he was proud of me. My mom, on the other hand, definitely did not want me moving in with some guy. So I invited Rick over to my parents' house. They met him for a little bit and they actually liked him. Fast forward 6 years, Rick and I are married, and my parents don't know that he was my boyfriend for 4 years. They think that we started dating after we moved in together. I kind of want to tell my parents, but I'm not sure. I think they would get really, really upset and possibly not speak to me. What do you think I should do? That's when my stepbrother grabbed my hand and kissed me in the movie theater. I was totally shocked. I knew that he had been flirting with me, but I didn't think that he was going to take it that far as to kiss me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. I repeat, this is not my story time. By the way, we were with 2 of his other friends. So these guys knew that I was his stepsister. After the movie, we all went back to his car and they drove me home. We didn't speak for the rest of the night. Obviously, I was already falling in love with him. I mean, he was so cute, so nice, and he liked me. The following day, my dad and I went over to his girlfriend's house, aka the mother of my stepbrother. That's when my stepbrother came up to me and grabbed my hand. I pulled it away as soon as I could because I thought someone had seen us. Luckily, the coast was clear. He took me to his bedroom and we just made out, while the rest of the family is downstairs having food. After about 10 minutes, we decided to go back downstairs. My stepbrother sat next to me, and underneath the table, he kept grabbing my knee. I was terrified that someone would see this. I mean, it's almost like he didn't care if we got caught. After that, my dad and I went home. And about 30 minutes after we got home, my stepbrother calls me and tells me that he's out front. I told him there was no way I could let him in and that he should just go home. And before I knew it, he had snuck in through my window. This is when I realized that I needed him to calm down because if we got caught, my dad would get really upset. I told him that he shouldn't have done that and that he needed to go home. That's when he confessed that he was in love with me. I mean, we had known each other for a few months, but we had only kissed like twice. He told me from the moment he set his eyes on me, he couldn't stop thinking about me. And he told me that him and his stepbrother actually fought over who would get to date me. I was actually flattered, but also concerned. That's when he told me that we should just date and we shouldn't care what our parents think. At first I said no, but then he kept trying to convince me. Suddenly, my dad knocks on my door and asks me who I'm talking to. Part 3 is up. Storytime about how I beat up my stalker of 4 years. When I was 18, I booked a major campaign. I started modeling at the age of 10, and it was a really big deal for me. This happened in a country where women are not treated very well. When my campaign came out, there were billboards of me everywhere in the city. My face was plastered on the internet and on social media too. Now from this, my Instagram grew a lot. Overnight, I went from having 6,000 followers to 40,000 followers. So by the end of the week, I had almost 100,000 followers. Again, this was a huge deal for me and I was really happy about it. But things started getting really weird when I started checking my DMs. I had about 40 DMs from one guy alone. The rest of the DMs were thirst traps, but this guy was different. He was becoming obsessive literally overnight. Every other message was about how beautiful I was and how he wanted to marry me. Instead of replying, I decided to ignore his messages. From this campaign, I started getting even more modeling jobs, and I also started getting paid to post stuff on Instagram. I was super happy. When I checked my DMs again, I noticed that he was messaging me even more. Once again, I ignored every single one of his messages. But after 4 days, he started getting really angry. Started commenting bitch on all of my pictures. Got to the point where I had to tell my modeling agency, and they just told me to ignore him too. A few days later, I opened his DMs only to see a picture of my house. Part 2 of how I beat up my stalker of 4 years. When I opened his DM, I saw that he sent me a picture of my own house. And this meant he knew where I lived. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I was sending me on Instagram. Once again, I told my modeling agency, and again, they told me to just ignore it. But it terrified me that he knew where I lived. Luckily, I lived in a really big apartment building, so I don't think he knew exactly what floor I lived on. But I took a chance and I sent him a message asking him politely to leave me alone. Believe it or not, this went on for 4 years. I would tell him to leave me alone and he would just come back with more things to say. During those 4 years, I did travel a lot for modeling, so it didn't bother me that much. Not until I got pregnant. He actually sent me a picture of me pregnant. That's when he told me that I had betrayed him and that I was cheating on him. One day I'm at my apartment, and yes, I had already met a man at this time and we were engaged. My fiance was out at work. I decided to take some time off of modeling since I was pregnant. Suddenly I get a knock on my door. I opened the door to a stranger I had never seen before. Obviously at the time I didn't know it was my stalker because I didn't know what he looked like. That's when he hands me a package and he tells me that I must have left it downstairs. I told him I hadn't ordered anything, and then he asked if he could come in. I said no, but he pushed his his way in. When he grabbed my hand and started begging for forgiveness. And he confessed that he had been sending me the messages for 4 years. Started yelling at him to leave, but he wouldn't. He tried to kiss my pregnant belly and asked me if it was his son. And that's when I just started kicking and punching him. And I didn't stop until he was out the door. When I looked at his face, he was bleeding and scratched all over. Neighbor had come out and had already called the cops, thank God. Cops arrested him and he was taken away. They were only able to hold him for 2 weeks. Apparently he had not broken any laws. This man is out there free. What should I do? Storytime about how my neighbor tried to unalive me. 4 years ago, my husband and I had just moved into a new neighborhood. We were newly married and were trying to have kids right away. My husband and I were also really social, so we would invite our neighbors over and host parties. We had a really big, beautiful house with a pool, so we always took advantage. Mostly everyone on our block would come to our get-togethers, but there was always this one couple that never showed up. I didn't think anything of it until one of my neighbors told me not to invite them to any other event in the future. When I asked her why, she said the police would go off into their house, and that the husband and the family was suspected of abusing the entire family. Obviously, after this, I stopped inviting them. Every single day, I would go on walks with my husband. Well, one night, my husband decided to stay home, so I went by myself. I decided to change my route and walk in front of the neighbor's house, the one everyone was scared of, and as soon as I turned down the street, I saw a man by the window. I looked away really fast because I didn't want him to think that I was staring, although I was. Suddenly, his front door opens and he comes outside. And all he says is, "You're the new neighbor, right?" I simply replied, "Yes, and nice to meet you." He stared at me for a few seconds, didn't say anything, and closed his door. I obviously thought this was strange. I kept walking, but a few minutes later, I noticed that he was right behind me, and something told me to run back home, which I did. That's when I realized he knew where I lived. Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how my neighbor tried to unalive me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. I ran back home as quickly as I could. I told my husband that the neighbor followed me home, but he told me to just forget about it. A few days later, I come home from running some errands. I get out of my car, and out of the corner of my eye, I see my neighbor standing behind a tree, and I could tell that he's looking at me. I decided to just ignore it because I didn't actually want to have to make conversation. Instead, I grabbed the groceries and walked into the house. I began closing the door, but he pushed his way in. I backed away and asked him what he wanted. He asked me if my husband was home. And no, my husband was not home, but I said yes. Then he looks around and asks me if he could get a little tour of the house. He also said that he really wanted to see the pool. Okay, I know what you're gonna think, but I was so scared I thought that if I just showed him the house, he would leave. I walk him over to the backyard and he starts looking around. That's when he asked me if we had any security cameras. My hands and knees started to shake, and once again I lied and said yes. He started looking around some more and said, "Nope, you definitely don't have any." I told him I needed to leave the house and if he could just leave. He starts to laugh and tells me that I should be nicer to him. He ripped my phone out of my hands and threw it into the pool. Instantly, I sprinted away from him. He grabbed my hair and I fell really hard to the ground. Part 3 is up. Part 3 of how my neighbor tried to unalive me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I'm sending me on Instagram. He pulled my hair hard and I fell to the ground. That's when I just started kicking as hard as I could. I heard him scream and he fell back. I got up and ran straight back into the house and locked the door behind me. He came up to the door and started banging on it. He told me if I didn't let him in that he would break the door. That's when he grabbed a chair and started throwing it against the glass. Luckily, the windows are hurricane proof, so he couldn't come in. I called 911 and then my husband. I went around the house locking every single door and window. He would just follow me from window to window yelling at me. He told me he just wanted to talk to me and that I was overreacting. Finally, I could hear the sirens around the corner. And of course, he started running away. Finally, the cops found him. His pockets, they found zip ties, and his car was loaded with rope and different things. Apparently, he planned on taking me to the woods. He's now in prison, but I'm so scared that he'll get out. What should I do? Story time about how I hooked up with my best friend's fiance and all of the groomsmen. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. I repeat, this is not my story time. My best friend and I met 2 years ago. Her and I both worked at stripper clubs and we made a lot of money together. One day she met this guy at the club and he took her out on a date and then they got engaged about 2 months later. Yep, it was really fast. Me, on the other hand, I dated a bunch of guys and never really found anyone because they would all ghost me. When my best friend decided to get engaged, I told her I would help her plan the wedding. At first, it was really fun, but soon my best friend turned into a bridezilla. She was the worst. She was always angry, super emotional, and didn't like any of the things that I helped her choose. Oh my god, and when it came to the cake, she was totally indecisive. That's when she started getting to a lot of fights with her fiance because he wasn't pulling his weight. Which, trust me, I totally understood because he was more interested in playing football with his friends and hanging out with his friends than actually helping her out with the wedding. This, to me, of course, was a really big red flag. I actually started getting more and more suspicious of him, so I decided to do some digging. On his Instagram, I saw that he followed a bunch of local girls. So I decided to make a second Instagram and basically pretend I was him. I reached out to these girls and told them that I was him and that I just made a second account and that I wanted them to know that this was my account. And believe it or not, some of these girls fell for it and had full-on conversations with me thinking I was him. In order to find out information, I would ask them questions. And sure enough, some of these girls were telling him that they had so much fun the last time they saw him. One even asked to see him again. This really stressed me out a lot because I didn't know how to break the news to my best friend. At that time, I just didn't know how to cope with stress, so I basically went and got drunk. I was super upset at my best friend's fiance, so I decided to call him and confront him about it. So I called him and told him that we needed to meet up. And he said yes. Mind you, I'm still drunk. He shows up to my apartment, comes in, and brings beers with him. I was like, oh my god, he's actually gonna try to hook up with me. I knew it right away. Part of me was like, what the heck? But the other part of me was like, I mean, he is cute. Ever since he started dating my best friend, I could tell that he was a little flirty with me, but it never occurred to me that he actually wanted to actually hook up with me. But I knew that he was only doing this because he thought I was super drunk. So I started drinking some more beers and it happened. I woke up feeling super sick to my stomach. I knew what I had done and I didn't know how I was going to tell my best friend now. Thankfully, he had already left my apartment when I woke up. That same night, one of the groomsmen was hosting a party at his house. My best friend and I got ready together in her house and then we went over to the party. And the whole time she kept asking me what was wrong. She could tell that something was off. I couldn't even look her in the eyes. We went to the party and I basically hooked up with all of the groomsmen in one night. That's when my best friend's fiance came up to me and asked me what I was doing because he saw me making out with 3 of the other guys. He grabbed my arm and told me that I needed to relax and that if I wanted to be with him that I couldn't be hooking up with his friends. I was so shook. He actually thought I was going to continue a relationship with him, and the whole time I'm only doing this because I'm trying to get him out of my system. A few days passed by and I still don't know how to tell my best friend. So I cooked dinner and invited my best friend over. I was going to break the news to her. As soon as she came into my apartment, I just said it. I told her I hooked up with her fiance and all of the groomsmen, and that I caught him cheating on her. Part 2 is up. Story time about how I hooked up with my best friend's fiance and all of the groomsmen. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. I repeat, this is not my story time. That's when I decided to confess to my best friend that I had done all of these horrible things to her. I invited her over for dinner and as soon as she came in, I just vomited out everything. When I told her all of the truth, she said nothing. She stayed quiet for a few minutes. By the way, I was crying. I was sobbing. She then started to laugh. I asked her why she was laughing and she told me that the truth was that she didn't want to get married to him anymore. And that she already knew that he was being unfaithful to her and that she knew that we hooked up. And when I asked her how she found out, she said that she actually followed him that night to my apartment. And that she saw he stayed in here for hours. She said she called my phone and I didn't answer, so obviously she connected the dots. And she told me that she didn't care if I hooked up with the groomsmen. She also said that she knew that he was hooking up with a bunch of girls around town. And that she had been following him for around 2 weeks, seeing who he was hooking up with. I explained to her that I was really drunk and that I just didn't realize what I was doing. Then she actually forgave me. She said that she had been planning on breaking up with him, but she didn't know how to do it. And that I actually helped her decide whether or not she should break up with him. But she was really angry. She was mostly angry at her fiance. So here's what we did. We got his car impounded. We even called his parents and told him what he had been doing. She even called the landlord and told him that he had been doing horrible things in the apartment and that he needed to be kicked out ASAP. She ghosted him and blocked him from everything. Luckily, my best friend lives in a gated community, so he actually couldn't come into her apartment. He even reached out to me, but of course, I blocked him and did the same thing. So now he was literally homeless, without a car, and since his parents were mad at him, they didn't take him in. So he had to go to stay with one of the groomsmen that I had already hooked up with. The next logical step was to sell the engagement ring. We went to a pawn shop and she got $15,000 for it. With the $15,000, we actually started our own little business and even went on vacation to Cancun for 2 weeks. He's still trying to reach out to her and me. He sent me messages on Instagram apologizing. And of course, he's asking me to convince my best friend to get back with him. We actually met this big director while we were traveling and told him about the story, and he actually wants to turn it into a movie. Who knows if it'll happen yet, but I'm hoping it will. And when it comes out, you guys will know who it is. Now we live in a really big fancy house. We actually run our business from home and we travel whenever we want. Now the question is, would you have forgiven me or not? Bye. Story time about how my husband and my dad got into a fist fight on our wedding day. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I was sending me on Instagram. My dad is in the military, therefore he is super strict. He's never liked any of my boyfriends and especially my fiance. My fiance is a musician, so he sometimes doesn't have a lot of income. So my dad thinks that he's absolutely lazy. I have a really good job and I always end up making a lot more than my fiance. This means that I have to make up for his lack of money. So usually I end up paying for most of the bills and my fiance ends up paying for about a third of our rent. And we do live in a nice fancy apartment. I mean, we've got a pool, a sauna, there's a bunch of amenities, and most of the time my fiance only gives me about $500 towards rent. My dad knows all of these issues, and trust me, it is an issue for me because I want him to be able to provide for me and our babies whenever I get pregnant, but it really irks my dad. But of course, it really bothers my dad. Every time my fiance and I go over to my parents for dinner, my dad is always making comments about how he doesn't earn enough money, and he asks him like, how are you going to provide for your family? And that's when my fiance and him usually get into a fight. Our wedding day was quickly approaching, so I wanted to keep a distance between my fiance and my dad. Everything was good up until the reception. My now husband and I were saying hello to friends. Out of nowhere, my dad tackles my husband down. That's when all hell breaks loose. Part 2 is up. Part 3 of how my dad attacked my husband on our wedding day. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My dad attacked my husband for a second time. Luckily, my friend's boyfriend, who was a cop, was there and was trying to manage the situation. Basically, we called off the entire reception. So $7,000 right down the drain. My husband and I were supposed to leave that night to Greece. I told my parents we should still go on the honeymoon and they agreed. But obviously, my dad was really upset about it. But while we were in Greece, I caught my husband texting his ex again. This woman texted him saying that she missed him. Then he told her about the fight he got into with my dad. Then she said that my whole family is crazy and that he shouldn't have married into it. I confronted my husband and he told me that he needed her as a friend and that I just needed to deal with it. Then I told him that I was the one that paid for basically everything in our relationship, including most of our wedding and our honeymoon, and that he needed to be grateful to me and to my family. That's when he said that he would never speak to my family again. That's when I told him that the relationship wasn't gonna work then. Now that we're back home, my parents really want me to get a divorce, but I'm not sure. Obviously, he has feelings for his ex and so does she. But I mean, I still love him. Why should I lose out? My husband is being super distant and barely talks to me. My dad is upset with me too because I haven't gotten a divorce. Should I just file for divorce? What should I do? Story time about how I caught my mom hooking up with my guy best friend. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My best friend and I have known each other for 7 years. Let's call him Mark. Mark and I met when we were in school and we have been inseparable since then. Everyone's constantly telling us that we should date, but we're not into each other like that. Last year, my parents started fighting a lot because my dad found out that my mom cheated on him. And she cheated on him with my dad's best friend. My mom's the kind of woman that constantly seeks attention from men. And growing up, she weirdly competed with me. Like anytime I liked a boy, she would flirt with him in front of me. So yeah, my mom's not the best when it comes to stuff like that. So when my dad found out that my mom was cheating on him, I basically just wanted to keep the peace. And I convinced my dad to not get a divorce. Huge mistake. Fast forward to 2 months ago. Mark was just about to turn 20, so I had been planning a birthday party for him. Because of COVID, I was only inviting our immediate family and close friends. And of course, my mom had to interject and wanted to help me plan everything. I told her several times I didn't need her help, but she insisted. Let me just say this. Before any of this happened, it never occurred to me that my mom was even attracted to Mark. I saw him as like a brother to me, so I assumed that she would see him the same way. My mom and dad kept arguing every single day. Mark would come over and he would just let me vent to him. The day of Mark's birthday party is when I started noticing some weird things. My mom, of course, had to drink a lot of champagne, so she was getting a little tipsy. She insisted on dancing with Mark and like making this big scene, so they started dancing. More people joined the dance floor and it became like a real party. A few hours later, I see my mom and Mark sitting on the couch, but my mom is crying her eyeballs out, complaining about my dad, and Mark is just there listening to her. I mean, she's putting him in a weird position. I literally had to peel my mom off of Mark and take her home and put her into bed. Thankfully, Mark just thought it was funny, so he didn't get upset. A few weeks later, I come home and find Mark in the kitchen with my mom. Once again, my mom is drinking and complaining about my dad. And once again, Mark is just listening to her. But here's the thing. My mom was standing there in a bikini, supposedly ready to get in the pool. Part 2. So my mom is standing there in a bikini trying to seduce my guy best friend. Disclaimers is not my story time. It's sent to me on Instagram. I asked my mom nicely to go put on some clothes and she refused. So I grabbed Mark's hand and told him to come upstairs with me. I asked him what was going on between him and my mom and he said nothing. And he even said that I was ridiculous for even suggesting something like that. And I believed him, so I let it go. A few days later, my mom is dressed up all sexy in a red tight dress, supposedly making breakfast for my dad and I. But my dad had already left for work, and I was going to school, so she knew that. I had the feeling that she had Mark coming over and she didn't want me to know. So I got in my car and told her I was leaving for school. Instead, I waited around the corner and I saw Mark driving up to the house. I waited for about 10 minutes and then I quietly pulled into the driveway and opened the door. And what do you know? My mom is sitting on the countertop making out with my guy best friend. And they were going at it. Like if I hadn't gotten there, it would have happened, you know? I slammed the door and my mom jumps off the counter. Mark pretends that nothing's wrong and tells me that he has to go to school. But of course, I didn't let him leave. That's when my mom told me that they were in love. And what do you know? Mark confirmed it. That's when my mom basically begged me not to tell my dad anything. And that her and Mark were going to continue seeing each other. I told my mom I'd keep the secret. But instead, I drove straight to my dad's job and told him everything. He went straight to his lawyer and filed for divorce. When he confronted her, my mom basically said that I was lying and that I had for some reason made everything up. Mark, on the other hand, is totally in love with her, but she's telling him to leave her alone. So she also broke his heart. He doesn't even want to go back to school, and he's begging me to get my mom and him back together. I told him that that would never happen because my mom is never going to leave my dad. My dad makes a lot of money, and she has no job. He provides her a lifestyle that Mark could never. Now, here's the thing. My mom's accusing me of being a terrible daughter for telling my dad. But how could I not tell my dad? I mean, am I the asshole here? I doubt it, but what do you guys think? What should I do? Story time about how I fell in love with my stepdad and married him. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. I repeat, this is not my story time. My mom and dad divorced when I was 14 years old. This really affected me and I really wanted to move away from my parents. My mom has a tendency to be really controlling and my dad has always been like a really jealous dad. Like he never let me do anything fun or even let me hang out with boys. After they got divorced, I told my parents that I wanted to go to an art school. But not just any art school, this was a boarding school. I was really eager to get away from my parents and just basically have my own life. While I was in this art school, my mom actually remarried. So this guy became my stepdad. My mom told me that she was really in love with him and that everything was perfect. They would come visit me every now and then, so I did meet him a couple of times. Finally, when I was 18, I graduated and went back home. This is where things get really complicated. My mom owned 2 salons and was never home. My stepdad worked from home and was there all day. This meant that I had to spend a lot of time with him. Every now and then, he would ask me to go to dinner and to the movies, just like hang out. And before I knew it, I was developing feelings. Let me remind you again that I was 18. I knew that this was really bad. I mean, this was my mom's husband. But there was something about him I really liked. That's when he started opening up to me about how controlling my mom was in the relationship and how he was actually thinking of leaving her. Now, trust me, when he told me this, I was like, oh my god. But that's when I realized that he probably liked me too. I mean, we hung out all the time. And the vibes were there. I knew I had to get away, so I decided to go study abroad. But my stepdad and I kept in touch. He would email me and text me all the time. And before I knew it, we were talking every single day. One day I get a message from him saying that he caught my mom cheating. Now honestly, this didn't surprise me because that's why my mom's relationship with my dad ended. He asked me to come home and I did. And when I saw him again, I realized that I actually was falling in love with him. Part 2 is As my stepbrother is confessing to me that he's in love with me, my dad knocks on the door. My stomach sank really quick. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. I repeat, this is not my story time. My dad knocks on the door and asks me who I'm talking to. That's when my stepbrother runs into my closet and just hides. I opened the door and explained to my dad that I was on the phone with a friend. He said okay and just left. But I could tell that he was suspicious. I let my stepbrother out of the closet and told him to leave. That's when he said that he wanted to stay over. Oh my god, I could have just died at that moment. That's when my dad opens the door and catches him. That's when my dad chased him around the house and told him to leave. I was beyond mortified. Oh, and I forgot to mention, my dad and my stepmom were already married. So he calls her and tells her everything that happened. Of course, I denied that he and I did anything, but my dad was not believing me. He told me that while I still lived under his roof, I had to follow his rules. And that meant not dating my stepbrother. The very next day, my stepbrother calls me and asks me to move in with him. He told me that we should get our own apartment and that way we can be happy together. Honestly, I didn't even know what to say because I wasn't in love with him like he said he was in love with me. Of course, this made my dad even more angry. He warned my stepbrother to stay away from me. Obviously, this is causing problems between him and his new wife. And yeah, I feel really bad. Now that I haven't seen my stepbrother in about a week, I'm starting to realize that maybe I am in love with him. Because I can't stop thinking about him and all I want to do is spend time with him and call him. So I'm seriously considering moving in with him, but I'm not sure how this is going to affect my dad or his new marriage. I mean, it's not like we're blood related and I'm already 18. So my dad kind of has to accept this, but he's so stubborn. Now my stepbrother wants me to be his girlfriend and I don't know what to say. I really need some advice. Help. Story time about how I hooked up with my stepbrother. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I repeat, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My dad and I moved to a new town after he got divorced from my mom. The plan would be that I would split my time with my mom and my dad. Now, with the divorce, I actually got really depressed and it really did affect me. Also, I had just turned 18 at the time and I didn't really want to go to college, so I didn't know what to do with my life. My mom asked me if I wanted to go on a trip to Europe with her and I said yes. So my mom and I traveled for about 2 months. When I got home, I decided to go spend time with my dad for a few months. Well, guess what? He already had a new girlfriend. And of course, this affected me really, really badly. And my mom too. Her and I were both surprised that he moved on so quickly. His new girlfriend was okay. She was much younger than my mom, but still older than me. But here's the thing, she had 4 kids. She invited me and my dad to come over for dinner so that we could get to know her kids a bit better. Mind you, I had never met them at this point. I had just gotten back from Europe. So I go over to their house for dinner, and as soon as I walk in, I am greeted by the 2 most beautiful guys I have ever seen in my entire life. They were both in their early 20s, and like I said, I was 18. The other 2 kids were teenagers. Throughout the dinner, I couldn't stop staring at both of these guys. I was really trying not to be obvious, but I had just never seen such beautiful guys. It turns out one of them was actually a model and the other one was a bodybuilder. So you can imagine what they might have looked like. Also, throughout the dinner, they kept making eye contact with me. It was almost like they were competing. After dinner, my dad and I went back to his place. This is when my dad asked me what I really thought of his girlfriend. And I told him that I didn't think he should have moved on that quickly, but at the same time, she was actually a good person. She obviously cared about her kids, and they had a pretty good life. That's when my dad told me that he was going to ask her to marry him. They had not been together very long, but I said, okay. Of course, my dad asked me to plan the whole thing with him. He proposed, and of course, she said yes. And this is when it hit me. These 2 really attractive guys were now going to be my stepbrothers. Awkward. This also meant that I started hanging out more and more at their house. My dad and I would go over for dinners, we would all spend the day in the pool, and basically just hang out. And this meant that I started getting to know my stepbrothers a little better. Right away, I could tell that they were starting to flirt with me while we were all together and separately. Of course, I was totally single, so I was like, well, you know, whatever. After dinner one night, my dad asked me if I was interested in one of them. And I was like, no, Dad. He told me that I couldn't stop staring at the guys and that I needed to calm down. Oh my God. I was totally blushing and I told him that nothing was going to happen and not to worry. I decided to put some space between me and the guys. One of them actually decided to reach out on Instagram and ask me why I was being so cold. Obviously, I didn't tell him that my dad told me to stay away from them, so I just pretended like I didn't know what he was talking about. That's when he asked me if I wanted to join him and his friends to go to the movies. I couldn't resist and I said yes. While we were watching the movie, he actually grabbed onto my hand and kissed it. And he kissed me, part 2.